Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The J Reels Podcast.
I'm elated and honored to welcome in a new partnership here on the podcast. Are you familiar with Olipop Soda? If you're not, well, listen up. I haven't been a soda drinker for quite some time. But when I discovered Olipop and what they're all about, I was all in. Not only is it a prebiotic soda that's good for your gut, it's non-GMO, organic, with ingredients that you can actually read. That's right, no 12 or 14-letter words that you can't pronounce. And are you worried about the dreaded high fructose corn syrup? Not here, as there's very little sugar, only 4 grams per serving. And the flavors? You have vintage cola, orange squeeze, my favorite, tropical punch, banana cream, what? Plus the classics such as root beer, ginger ale, lemon lime, which has a better taste. What? How could I forget about the taste? Crisp, refreshing, without feeling bloated afterward than the usual brands that you're familiar with. Right now, you can get 15% off at checkout when you use the code SODALOVE, and I'll get a percentage of that based on your purchase. It's a win-win for you and I. Please go to drinkolipop.com and get 15% off by using the code SODALOVE at checkout. Thanks to the good people at Olipop, and an early thank you for shopping at drinkolipop.com. What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. The Ides of March are on the horizon, and so is the latest podcast, filling your cup and then some on all of what's happening in the world of sports, as this is the J Reels Podcast with your host, J Reels. For my first timers, welcome aboard, and for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And we are starting to inch a little bit closer, people. Selection Sunday's this coming Sunday for the NCAA tournament, which will start, I understand, a week from tomorrow, but we all know 10 days from now, the tournament will be in full bloom with the craziness and the madness starting next Thursday, as we'll unpack all that. More so a week from today, when the selection and the brackets will be filled, and we'll get a full analysis of what's going to take place as conference tournament week will begin, or pretty much has begun when you think about it. And I'll get into that later on, as well as what's happening on the ice with all the trades, with the deadline leading up to this past Friday, some Major League Baseball developments, as well as the NFL, which has been percolating for the last week, including Russell Wilson going to Pittsburgh. You know I have to throw in my 2 cents when it comes to that. We'll get into that later on. I'm going to start with the association, and only because the NBA, they're going to be off in the clouds for probably the next couple of weeks, and a lot of that will have to do with what's going to happen in college basketball, because everybody's going to be geeked up and pumped up to see what's going to transpire here over the course of the next 6 days leading into Selection Sunday, the teams that are on the bubble, and of course I'll get to that later on, and who will make the tournament, who's going to have that run through their conference tournament to see if they could plant their flag as Big East, ACC. You could go through all of the conferences throughout the nation and see where we'll end up a week from today when we unpack what will be, I would think, a thrilling and very unpredictable tournament. So the NBA, I would think between now and as we get toward the end of the month, barring anything crazy with injuries, which have been continuing to mount in the association, I'll get to that in a second, but I would think that they're going to not necessarily lay low on purpose, but they're going to get swallowed up by what's going to happen here with March Madness. But with the association, you've had a couple of interesting storylines over the last few days, and the first one being Luka Doncic. Now, when it's all said and done, is anybody going to care? Is he going to be an MVP at the end of the year? I would think he's going to be in the running, but will he win the whole thing? Probably not. But he is going through a very unprecedented stretch to where he has now 6 games in a row consecutively where he's had triple doubles, but not only that, but in the 30-point variety. And he eclipsed that there a couple of nights ago where Russell Westbrook had that record of 5 straight 30-point triple doubles. At the end of the day, is that a big thing? No. I bring that up because as brilliant and as great of a player that Luka Doncic is, when you look at Dallas and where they stand in the Western Conference, they are not in the top 3. They're not even in the top 5. They're not even in the top 6 when it comes to the playoffs, where generally when you're in those top 6 in the conference, you stay away from the play-in scenario. And right now, the Dallas Mavericks are far from that. And even with the brilliance of Luka and what he's been able to do here, not only during this stretch, but this year, and of course, throughout the course of his NBA career. But if you're a Maverick fan, you have to look at where they're at and wonder whether or not they're going to be a team that can make it in to the tournament when it's all said and done, as they're currently 8th in the West. And I understand that could change at the drop of a hat, because they're just a half game behind the Sacramento Kings for the 7th spot. And then technically they're just a game behind the Phoenix Suns. We're at 36-28. Phoenix is 37-27. So I understand a lot could happen and a lot could really develop, not only throughout the course of these next few days, but the final stretch of games here as we are entering the final month of the NBA season. But even with that clip that he's gone on and this tear of him getting all these triple doubles, what is it accounted for when you look at the Mavericks in a very competitive West? I understand, but for me, I'd be a lot more comfortable if I was a Maverick fan to be at a point where if they were 4th, 5th, or even 6th, I could breathe a little bit, because there's no guarantee that Dallas will be able to get to the next round or really to qualify for the tournament to be one of those top 8 seeds. And I get it. Them going to Sacramento, not that that's going to be insurmountable to say the least, because if they do win that game, if the season were to end today, they would automatically be in the playoffs. But you have to wonder how much length are they going to have, considering his brilliance to go along with Kyrie Irving, on whether or not this is going to be a team that's going to be a dark horse or be, I would even say, a sleeper in the Western Conference when it's as competitive as can be with the Minnesota Timberwolves as well as Oklahoma City. I get it that they're young guns there at the top, and you can't expect them to maybe go deep into a postseason run, considering that they're relatively green, more so Oklahoma City than Minnesota. But with Denver there looming as a defending champ, with the Clippers, and who knows what you're going to get out of them, considering that they've never even made it to an NBA final, but with their veteran leadership led by the usual suspects, Kawhi Leonard, Paul George, even James Harden for that matter. And then you have Phoenix, who I get it, even at 6 right now, underachieving all year when you look at the talent and their roster, but we understand that they could have a hot stretch in front of them come April, May, or June. So that remains to be seen. New Orleans, I understand, another team that's a young gun, a la Minnesota, Oklahoma City, currently at 5th in the Western Conference, but can you really trust them to go to a conference final, or dare I even say an NBA final? So for Luka and everything that he's done and his brilliance and MVP candidacy, I get it, but they're currently 8th. And even though it's not a stretch for them to not get out of that opening round if they are in the play-in tournament scenario, or even if they drop further deep, which right now the Lakers are just a game behind them for the 8th spot in the conference. And then Golden State, if you want to throw them in the mix, they are 2.5 games behind the Mavericks. So still plenty of basketball to be played. And yes, we could throw all the flowers at the feet of Luka Doncic, but when we take a grand 30,000-foot view of the Mavericks, they're an 8th seed. And that's all there is to it. And with all the work and all of the domination that he's had here over the last couple of weeks, it still hasn't gotten them that far out west. So that's my point there to kick us off. And then you have the Lakers, speaking of which, where Anthony Davis had a very interesting stat line. 27 points, 25 rebounds in a win against the Timberwolves last night, who are without Karl Anthony Towns. And we talked about that on Thursday's podcast, to where a lot of these guys have been injured, and I'll get into a couple of other injuries that have cropped up here over the last few days. But without Karl Anthony Towns, who's going to be out for at least 4 weeks, he's going to be reevaluated at that time, and it's quite possible that he may make it into the first round, maybe even the middle or the latter part of the first round of the NBA playoffs. But without Karl Anthony Towns, Anthony Davis was able to put up not only 27, 25, but also 7 steals, 5 assists, 3 blocks, a stat line unlike any other in the history of the sport. Now, are you going to go crazy about that? No, you look at the 27, 25, and 7 steals as a big man. To have those type of numbers, that's certainly very impressive. But the Lakers, as I mentioned, currently 9th in the Western Conference as they try to find their way out of that 7-10 range, which I'm sure would be a welcome addition to them trying to get into the postseason, not having to worry about a play-in game or 2, if that were to be the case, where they could just rest up, especially LeBron at 39 years of age, to get himself ready for you would think maybe, I'm not going to say another conference final run, but if you're the Lakers, it's about trying to get to an NBA final. It's not about winning a round or two and being successful to think that, hey, we had a good season and we got at least to a conference final. Not if you're an LA Laker. So for Anthony Davis to have that stat line last night, super impressive, ultra impressive. But again, the Lakers are where they are. And when it's all said and done, you would think they're going to make it into the postseason. But we will certainly continue to monitor what the Lakers are going to do from here on out. And as far as the injuries go, you had Steph Curry in a big scare there on Thursday night to where he turned his ankle and he didn't even land on anybody. It was just him trying to get to the basket, dished it off to the corner. I believe it was Klay Thompson who attempted a three. And for Curry to turn his ankle, and he has had an injury history when it comes to his ankles, surgery, etc. But for the Warriors, they breathed a sigh of relief only because the MRI came back negative. So that's a huge plus for them. As we know, the Warriors are 10th in the Western Conference, and there's no threat behind them because the Rockets are currently 4.5 games behind. So at least they have a bit of some breathing room, knowing that there's not a team that's nipping on their heels. And I get it that they want to try to move up these standings out west to not be in that bottom, because even if they were, let's say, a 7-8 seed, to where even if they were to lose, they would still have an opportunity to play for another day. But that's only if they're 7 or 8. If they're 9 or 10, it's one and done. Now, if they do win that 9-10 matchup, which the league would hate, between the Lakers and Warriors if the season ended today, but if they were to lose that game, they're done. But if they're 7-8, considering, let's say, if Dallas were to lose that game, then Dallas at least has another opportunity to get into the postseason by playing the winner of the 9-10 game. So for the Warriors, although they do have a little bit of a safety net, not having to worry about a team behind them creeping up and surpassing them and maybe falling out of the playing scenario, but they don't have any margin for error when it comes to being that 9-10 seed, because if they lose, they're done. And that would be just a terrible feeling for Adam Silver and all the suits at the NBA, knowing that Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, etc., and the 4-time champion just 2 years ago removed from their last championship would be out of the postseason. And then you have Benedict Mathurin, the Indiana Pacer guard forward, who's going to be out for the rest of the year with a torn labrum. And that is not going to be a big blow, but that's certainly going to be a blow for a young player on a team that's looking to see if they can make some hay in the East to go along with Tyrese Halliburton and Pascal Siakam, Miles Turner, etc. And he actually has been playing well of late, averaging 19 points over the last 5 or 6 games, averaging 14-2 for the year. So a guy who's not supposed to carry the mail or be that guy in the team, but certainly a complimentary player. You're not going to have him for the rest of the year. So that's going to be a bit of a blow for a Pacer team that, again, is trying to see what they could do in an Eastern Conference where, yes, Boston, Milwaukee, and even Cleveland, if you want to throw them in the mix, but maybe they could surprise some people, win a round, maybe even get to a conference final. I get it, that's a long shot, but still, that is a blow for a Pacer team that is trying to find their way in the East. And then you had a weird game last night, and I didn't watch because Sixers-Knicks, is that going to be on my radar on a Sunday night? Absolutely not. But you had a final score of 79-73, and it took me back to the 90s and early 2000s to where it was just an all-out bloodbath of fouls, of games that were 2.5 to 2 hours and 45 minutes, where the NBA back then, it was all about defense, hand checking, etc. That's one of the reasons why you don't see games below 80. Let alone, think about that, 79-73 for both teams. It was the first time that happened in almost 8 years. You have to go back to the 2016 season where Denver and Minnesota, where the Nuggets beat the T-Wolves in a score that both teams were under 80. I mean, think about that. Now, that was 8 years ago, but that was the norm going back to the 90s. You've had NBA Finals games end up with a score like what you saw last night between the Sixers and Knicks. And the Sixers are still in town, as they'll also play the Knicks tomorrow night. So you have a scheduling quirk to where you have a team that's just 90 miles south of New York City. For them to be in town for 2 days, or really for 3 days, to play 2 games over the course of 3 days is a rarity, to say the least. And I understand with COVID over the last few years, you had those scheduling situations to where you want to have one team play in one city, but considering Philadelphia is literally right down the street and not a team that's in the Midwest or even the West Coast where you can understand why that they would sit around here for a couple of days. But that's what you have there with the association. And other than that, there really isn't much to get into. I understand we can look at the T-Wolves. That's one, for instance, with the loss of Karl Anthony Towns and how his absence could hurt them as far as seeding goes, because not only is Oklahoma City currently in first place by percentage points over the Nuggets, and if I do my math correctly, they are 45-19. That's what, 64? No, in fact, they do have a one-game advantage because Denver's 44-20. So for the Nuggets, who knows? Maybe they got them right where they want them, knowing that the T-Wolves may fall back in the pack a little bit. And Oklahoma City, this is uncharted territory for them. Maybe the Nuggets could overtake them when it's all said and done. And for them to get the one seed, not that that would be important for a Nugget team who won a championship last year and know their way around the playoffs. But this will be an interesting time to see whether or not Oklahoma City could match wits, power, talent, etc. against Denver to see if they could hold them off to get a one seed, because I'm sure for them it would be important. Now, in the grand scheme of things, would Denver be scared to have to go into Oklahoma City for a Game 7 if that were to be the case in a conference final? Absolutely not. But you have to wonder about the T-Wolves here at this present moment, whether or not they fall back a little bit further. Now, they are just a game in the loss, but 2 games ahead of the Clippers for the 4th seed. I'm sure they do not want to go further than 3, because 3-6, that means that they would match up against Phoenix if that were to be the case. And I would think that they're going to try to tread water until they could get Karl Anthony Towns back. Chances are probably not for this regular season, so we'll certainly keep an eye on what the T-Wolves do here down the stretch as they try to, I'm not going to say gasp for air, but they're going to tread water to see if they could stay within one. Now, granted, they're only 2 games in a loss and 2.5 back, so it's not as if they're in a free fall, but you do have to consider whether or not the T-Wolves are going to be hanging around here and will be within striking distance of the 1 seed, or will they really start to drift off out to sea and lose grip of trying to see if they could get either a top seed or even a 2 seed there in the West. And in the East, it's pretty much been status quo. I know the Bucks have overtaken the Cavs going back to last week, and they have a half-game margin tied in the loss with the Cavaliers having a game in hand, so that's something to keep in mind. Knicks there at the 4 seed, just a half game ahead of the Orlando Magic there for the 5 seed in the East. Philadelphia, they're just a half game behind the Magic. And that's interesting too, because Philadelphia, although they're just a half game behind the 7 seed and the Indiana Pacers, but they are 2 games to see if they could get to a 4 seed. So that would be important for them. Then you have Indiana, Miami, Chicago. Big drop off there. Indiana, Miami, currently just a half game separating both of them in the East, 7th and 8th in the conference. And then you have Chicago, Atlanta to round out the 7 through 10 range, where the Hawks have a 3.5 game lead over the Nets. And you would think that those teams in both the East and West have no shot past the 10 seed to even creep or even overtake the 10 seeded Atlanta Hawks or even the Golden State Warriors out west to see if they could be a threat to squeeze into that play-in tournament. That's what you have in the NBA. I think from not here on out, but over the course of the next couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot of NCAA talk with March Madness that's going to overtake that association, the league, etc. So we'll certainly keep our eyes on that. Now to transition to the college game, and to me, it's all about the teams that are on the bubble here. And I'm not going to go through every conference or every team, etc. But there are teams of note that you have to wonder whether or not they're going to have a run in them to see if they could get into the tournament or maybe even win the conference overall. And as I look here just in my backyard when it comes to the Big East, I know the teams that are going to look to see whether or not that they could maybe punch their ticket to get into the dance, and there are some known teams. When you're looking at Villanova, who obviously are a far cry from their championship medal from Jay Wright. Just 2 years ago, they went to a Final Four, and now here they are at 17 and 14, seeing if they could even knock or even kick in the door to get into the Big East. As far as maybe even winning a championship, it's probably going to be unlikely, but you have them. You also have St. John's with some impressive wins as of late, but whether or not that they're going to be able to at least get to a conference final for the Red Storm. Same for Villanova for that matter. And even a team like Seton Hall. Those are three teams that usually have been in the tournament. Not necessarily St. John's, but Seton Hall, obviously Villanova, even Providence. You have a ton of teams that are on the bubble there just in the Big East alone. So we'll certainly keep an eye on that. As far as the ACC, you will look at a team like Virginia, maybe even Wake Forest. Remember, Wake Forest beat Duke just a couple of weeks ago. So although they have a good win under their belts, but that's not going to be enough in order for them to get into the tournament. They're currently 19-12. We're going to have to see whether or not they're going to have to get to at least, I would think, a conference final at best. And if they win the whole thing, then obviously they're going to be in. So we'll have to take a look to see what the Demon Deacons are going to do. Virginia, 22-9. That's another team that I would think if they get to a conference final, they should be in. Anything short of that, I don't know. They may not make it into the tournament, and we all know Virginia's had a recent history, not only being a one seed knocked off in the tournament in 2018, but then coming back to win a tournament just a year later. So who knows if the Cavaliers are going to have anything in the tank to see if they could get themselves into the tournament. You got to look at even a team when we transition Big 12, Oklahoma. Are they going to be a team that's going to sneak in when it's all said and done? I don't know about that. Big 10, Michigan State, who have been a staple under Tom Izzo, but at 18-13, are they going to find a way to get into the tournament with their beloved and just very popular and renowned head coach in a one-time Izzo? I don't know if it's going to be enough, especially with that record. I get it, reputation and coach aside, but still, they have not been worthy of trying to get or even making the tournament, especially up to this point. If they win the conference, obviously, that's a different story, but I don't know if Michigan State's going to make it there. And to me, it can't even be a conference final. They're going to have to win the whole thing in order for them to get in. That's just me. And as far as any other teams, Pac-12, will Colorado get in? Who knows? Even Oregon for that matter. And we know Oregon has been a team that has made the tournament year after year over the course of the last decade or so. SEC, who knows what A&M's going to have. We would think, obviously, the Kentuckys of the world, Alabama, Auburn, etc. They'll get in. Those are, to me, the big teams that we have to look out for as far as on the cusp or on the bubble to try to get into the tournament. We understand that anything can happen. We understand about the unpredictability, and for the team that could get on that run to be that Cinderella, anything can happen, as we know, once we get to this time of the year. But a lot of those teams could be on the fence and maybe even could be shut out, have it locked, and not be able to get in. Of course, we'll talk about that all a week from today when the brackets will be announced Sunday night, sometime around 6 p.m., and we'll certainly have it all for you as to who is in, who is out, who should have been in, who made it in, etc. As the tournament, like I mentioned, is just technically 8 days away, but really a week from this coming Thursday is when it will really tip off. And then you had a scenario yesterday with the women's college game. Not a good look for South Carolina and LSU. At the end of the game, or toward the end of the game, with about 3 minutes to go, you had a melee there between a couple of players, and you had 6 ejections to boot on top of that. Now, yes, when you think of 6 ejections, are you thinking that there were fists flying and bodies just falling on the floor? Thankfully, that was not the case. Certainly was not as ugly as that, but when you have players being pushed, and I get it that there's frustration there with Flau'jae Johnson pushing one of these South Carolina players. I understand they may have gotten into her face and frustration built and tempers started to flare to where Kamilla Cardoso came from across the court and pushed Johnson to the floor. That's when you had a bunch of teams or a bunch of players from the team start to converge there in the middle of the court, right by the scorer's table. Even the brother of Johnson jumped over the scorer's table where you had to have security and the police to jump in. Could have been a much uglier scene than what it was. And of course, in the postgame, Cardoso did apologize through Twitter. The coach, Dawn Staley of South Carolina, said, "This is not us. This is not who we are. This was an ugly display. No excuses whatsoever." And for that to end the way it did, and these are two rivals, who knows what this is going to mean moving forward. But for women's college basketball, which obviously has gotten a huge boost over the years, and even in particular over the last couple of years with the whole Caitlin Clark and what she's done, not only last year throughout the tournament and even this year's, breaking the NCAA scoring record. And I'm sure this is going to be a thrilling women's college March Madness for them. And I'll be maybe not on top of it, I'll be honest, but I'll certainly keep an eye on what's going to transpire here over the course of these next few weeks heading into April to the Final Four, etc. So you had that dust up. What that's going to mean as far as suspensions and things of that nature, I couldn't tell you. Maybe Cardoso is going to get a suspension considering she pushed Johnson and obviously had the I don't want to say Donnybrook, that's too strong, but you had the dust up. That's the right word that I used just a couple of seconds ago. And for both teams who I'm sure they were contrite and sitting on this for 24 hours and now having to pay the piper as to what kind of suspensions are going to be handed down right before the tournament, we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen there. But certainly not a good look, just a bad display there. And I get it. Frustrations boiled and tempers just gone awry. But for that sport, which has had just a boon of publicity, and rightfully so, and good for them, has a little bit of a black mark to them with this game yesterday, and I don't think this is going to have any lingering effect. Now, who knows? If they do play again, what that's going to mean, we'll have to wait and see. But you had that there yesterday between the women's game of the Gamecocks and Tigers there yesterday afternoon down in South Carolina. All right, now let me turn my attention as I lace up my skates and go take a trip on the ice for the NHL. And we had a lot of activity heading into the trade deadline, which was Friday, 3 p.m. And it's interesting because we talked about the teams that were making moves, that had made a lot of trades, whether it was the Rangers, whether you looked at a team like the Florida Panthers, and they also made another move there right before the deadline, which we talked about. But there were other teams that hadn't really made moves. Teams that you wonder whether or not that they were going to make a splash or make a deal for some reinforcements here for the final stretch of this NHL season. Whether your name was the Boston Bruins, whether your team was the Vegas Golden Knights, whether you were the Carolina Hurricanes, teams like that where they did not make a lot of noise heading into the final 24 hours of the trade deadline, but they certainly did so, and in a big way, especially if you're the Vegas Golden Knights, when they acquired Thomas Hertl from the San Jose Sharks, a guy who's going to just plug right in, and I would think big risk for the Golden Knights, only because Hertl signed an 8-year contract worth $65 million, and he's in year 2 of that, so he still has 6 more years left, and Hertl, who is very good at San Jose, and is certainly going to help the Golden Knights here down the stretch when you had other teams, whether you're Vancouver, make trades or even re-sign players for that matter with a guy like Elias Pettersson and a lot of other teams who were making moves at the deadline, and even the Dallas Stars. That was another team that we thought maybe would make a move, and they did not. Also, Colorado made some trades. But here are the big teams that I thought, or the big moves that were made by teams over the course of that final 24-hour stretch that I think may put them in the discussion for making a Stanley Cup final. The first team is the Carolina Hurricanes, because I wondered what they were going to do, considering that they are within arm's length of the Eastern Conference as far as the Metropolitan Division with the Rangers there. And even with the Panthers playing well and having the most points in the sport and the most wins, but for Carolina to not only acquire Evgeni Kuznetsov from the Washington Capitals, who's been off injured here, and who knows how much he's going to contribute down the stretch of the season, but by them getting Jake Guentzel, the former Pittsburgh Penguin forward who has history in the postseason, Stanley Cups, etc., to me, that was maybe the biggest move of all. And we could take a look at all the trades that were made, and not that I'm going to. It's going to take probably a whole podcast to dive into that. But Guentzel could be the one trade that could put the Carolina Hurricanes in the Stanley Cup Finals. Do I trust them overall? I can't say I do, just based on just the last couple of years. And I get it's a new year, anything can happen. And they've had big regular seasons. But when they lost to the Rangers there in the conference semifinals 2 years ago, including a Game 7 in their building, and then last year getting blitzed by the Florida Panthers in the conference final, who knows if Guentzel's going to be that guy in the room to say, hey, go on my shoulders, I'll carry you. Although he's not that type of player, but I'm sure by example he's going to lead and have that championship DNA to interspersed throughout that locker room, throughout his teammates, maybe even the coaches for that matter, to show that this is how we will embark on a long postseason run, is my experience, my toughness. Not that he's a tough guy, but he's a guy that knows his way around Stanley Cup contending hockey. Who knows? Maybe that's the one final piece of that puzzle for them to get into a final and maybe even over the hump to win the whole thing before it's all said and done. So that's one trade that you got to keep in mind. I don't know about Kuznetsov too much. I mean, I do know of him, of course. He had very successful years down in Washington to go along with Alexander Ovechkin, but recently just injuries and in and out of the lineup. I don't know how much you're going to get out of Kuznetsov, so that we'll certainly keep an eye on. Some toughness was added by the Boston Bruins, bringing in Pat Maroon from Minnesota. I thought that was a very good move for them. A guy who's also won Stanley Cups along the way, obviously just recently in Tampa with the Lightning and with the Blues back in 2019. So who knows? Maybe that's what the doctor ordered for the Bruins, considering they brought in Milan Lucic to have that presence there, some toughness, some physicality. And with him being on the shelf the whole year with that whole alleged domestic violence situation, and that, of course, he was acquitted on, but him not being back on the team, bringing in Maroon, certainly a big help to at least add some muscle to that lineup and some physicality, as I mentioned. The Lightning also made a couple of moves, bringing in Matt Dumba, defenseman, as well as Anthony Duclair, the former Florida Panther, as recent as last year. I know he's bounced around on a million teams, so they add some punch there offensively to go along with the likes of Nikita Kucherov, who's an MVP candidate, as we know. Also, the Devils have made a couple of trades, picking up the goaltender Jake Allen for insurance purposes, because the Devils, as they're trying to see if they can make a run here at the wild card spots, and I'll get to that in a minute because the Islanders have made a push here, surprisingly. Hang on for that. But the Devils have made a couple of moves there, and also trading Tyler Toffoli to Winnipeg. That was the only deal that Winnipeg made here to try to bolster their offense, to bolster their roster. And who knows what their situation is as far as money, to take on more as far as their salary cap. That I'm not really privy to. But you had a lot of deals, a lot of trades. Even Kyle Okposo, the former Islander, who was a Buffalo Sabre and a captain there for the Sabres, goes to Florida. That was their most recent addition that they had to go along with Vladimir Tarasenko earlier in the week. So lots of wheeling and dealing. Even Nashville trading for Jason Zucker, Jason Zucker from Arizona. So all these deals that have transpired here over the last week, and even more so leading up to the deadline on Friday. What is this all going to mean when we get to April, May, and June? This is why we watch sports. We'll have to wait and see how this is all going to shape up and unfold. And when we take a look at the sport, can I even discuss the Islanders for a second? Now, the Islanders are a team that have been hot and cold, up and down, Jekyll and Hyde throughout the course of the season. And here they are. Right now, when we look at the landscape, they are currently the hottest team in the sport. Winners of 6 in a row. They've catapulted themselves to the number 2 seed in the wild card scenario for the Eastern Conference. And as I pull up the wild card and overall standings, now the Islanders are 2 points behind Tampa for the 1 seed in the wild card. And as we know, there are only 2 wild card seeds, and with Tampa right ahead of them. And they do play Tampa later on this month, so that's going to be a big game. I believe it's out in the UBS Arena. I want to say it's actually the day before my birthday. It could be that Saturday. And I think the Panthers come into town 2 days prior to that. So the Islanders are currently in a flat-footed tie with the Red Wings for that final wildcard spot. So that's going to be a race to the very end. And the Red Wings, they have fallen flat on their face here. Considering the Islanders have won 6 in a row, the Red Wings have gone backwards and lost 5 in a row. So who knows how much of a tussle this is going to be between those 2 teams from here on out. You have the Capitals that are just 3 points behind both of those teams for the final spot. So you have to keep an eye on them, as well as the Devils. Now the Devils, they are 6 points behind the final wildcard spot in the East, 3 points behind the Capitals. And you want to throw in the Sabres and even the Penguins for that matter. I won't as of right this second, although they're both separated by 1 point each. Penguins 64, Sabres 65, Devils 66. Before you look at the Capitals, right now the Capitals may be the only threat there with the other 3 teams behind them in the rear. So that's what we have at the wild card. And the Islanders, listen, they've been on a West Coast swing. They've played well here. And who knows how much they can continue this. They beat the Bruins there a week ago in their building before beating St. Louis, before going on this trip. West Coast beating San Jose, Anaheim. I get it, they're the dregs of the West. But now they're going to take a step up by playing the Kings tonight. Let's see if they can continue the stretch. And their schedule is going to get trickier here because they still have to play the Rangers, count them, 3 more times the rest of this year, including this coming Sunday on St. Paddy's Day at the Garden. So they're going to have a very tough schedule here down the stretch. And if they're going to get into the postseason, they're going to earn it. They finish off this, you want to say West Coast trip by coming back east to play the Sabres in Buffalo there on Thursday before playing Ottawa at home. And then you have the Rangers there this coming Sunday, and then they have home against Carolina. They do play at Detroit, which is going to be huge. Winnipeg, New Jersey, at Florida, Tampa. Yeah, a ton of games. And in fact, I said those games were actually on the road. I said that they were at home. My apologies there. Those 2 games at the end of the month with Florida and Tampa, they're on the road. So they have a very tricky schedule to go along with the Rangers along the way. They still have to go to Nashville. And yeah, it is going to be for them to earn here throughout the course of this stretch, but they have won 6 in a row, and kudos to them, and let's see if they can continue their winning stretch in LA tonight before coming back east. So with them being the hottest team with that winning streak, Vancouver's right behind them. Vancouver's now won 5 in a row, and they are just running away with the Pacific Division. No shock there. They are currently at 42-17-7, 91 points. They have, a 16-point lead over the Knights. In fact, they actually have a 10-point lead over the Edmonton Oilers in the conference. The Knights have fallen really far back to the tune where they are in the wild card spot, where the Kings have played a little bit better here as of late. But with Vegas, even with their trade, bringing in Thomas Hertl, like I mentioned, they have fallen so far back that they were in first place for most of the year. Then Vancouver overtook them. Then Edmonton did, and now the Kings have, to where they're currently in the second wildcard spot behind the Nashville Predators, separated by 3 points. They're 78-75, where Nashville's currently at 78. And then you have Dallas, who are 4 points ahead of both Winnipeg and Colorado in the Central, 89-85, and they actually have won 5 in a row, and they didn't even make any moves at the deadline. As a matter of fact, let me just double check that. I know they didn't make anything in that 24-hour period right before 3 p.m. on Friday. But the Stars didn't really make a lot of moves. And for them to continue, as a matter of fact, they did get Christopher Tanev, now that I think about it, early in the week. But it wasn't as if they were very active leading up to the deadline. So for the Stars, who have played very well here and currently in first place, let's see how this is all going to shape up here over the course of this last month of the season. A lot of teams have played anywhere between 64 to 68 games. Let me just take a lay of the land here before we move on. NHL, teams 64, 66, no more than 68. As I look at it here. So we're getting toward the 16 to 18 game mark for the National Hockey League. And with all the trades and with all the player movement, it's going to be fascinating how this is going to unfold here as we head deeper into the month, into April, and then obviously once we get to the postseason, to where all these teams and where they're going to be seated. And unlike even the NBA for that matter, and I didn't even talk about the West as we broke down the wild card scenario there, Minnesota, they are 6 points behind the Golden Knights for the 2 seed in the wild card. Then you have Seattle, Calgary, and St. Louis, all with 67 points. Outside shot, I know they still have a lot of games left to go, but I'll just put Minnesota there, even though it is a 6-point difference, and Vegas actually has a game in hand, so that's a disadvantage to the Wild. But that's what we have. NHL, fast and furious. I get it that it's going to be about the tournament, maybe even baseball, as we're, 2.5 weeks away from the baseball season. So that's what we have there with the NHL. And as I move along here, I won't even get into baseball right now. I'll even put on my helmet and shoulder pads to get into the NFL because the new season, quote unquote, begins on Wednesday. And boy, have you seen a ton of player movement here over the course of the last 3, 4, 5 days, even dating back to last week, a lot of player cuts as we talked about. But the first one I'm going to discuss, and I understand there's a ton. The Denver Broncos are revamping here on the fly. Not only did they release Justin Simmons, their longtime safety, for forever, 8 years, and they also traded Jerry Jeudy. They traded him for a 5th and 6th round pick. And I believe after this year, he could be a free agent. So maybe that's why that the return was very low. Not to say that he's worth the 1st round pick. Maybe you could have plucked the 3rd round pick at best. Jerry Jeudy, his wondrous talent coming out of Alabama. A lot of people thought that he was going to be a top flight wide receiver here. Just 2 or 3 years into his career. And he has not really done much. And I get it that they've had Nathaniel Hackett there 2 years ago as the coach. Last year, Sean Payton. And they haven't really fired on all cylinders. So for Jeudy to be shipped to Cleveland, and that's a big pickup by the Browns to go along with Amari Cooper, David Njoku, the tight end. You're going to have Nick Chubb come back from the ACL injury last year. And they're going to have a loaded offense. Even Deshaun Watson, who missed the last part of the year. And to have Jeudy there as a complimentary wide receiver, to me, that was a great trade by the Browns because his ceiling is very high. You could talk about him being a bust, but to me, I think it's more of Denver, the system, and the lack of productivity on offense as far as what happened there in Mile High as opposed to the player itself. And then that rounds it off to the quarterback, as we knew Russell Wilson was going to be gone, and as we saw there Friday and even into the weekend where Russell Wilson was going to go to Pittsburgh and to New York to visit the Giants for back-to-back visits to see what was going to transpire, if there was going to be any interest for those two franchises. And then last night, we found out through Twitter that Russell Wilson signs a 1-year deal in Pittsburgh to possibly be the starting quarterback for the Steelers. How do I feel about that? Well, at first, if you watched my channel or watched any of my social media, how I was not in favor of it. And it wasn't because of the money. Because Denver, they're going to have to front a lot of the money that's owed. The, $39 million where they're paying 37.8 and the Steelers are only on the hook for the minimum, 1.2. So to me, it's not even about money. So no problem there. Here's the problem I have with this deal. Russell Wilson is going to be potentially a stopgap guy for a year. I can see if you're bringing in a guy who is just going to be in competition for the starting quarterback. For that, you bring back Mason Rudolph. And not to say Mason Rudolph is anything close to Russell Wilson, what he's done throughout his career. I get that. But now you're forging a scenario for training camp where all the pressure is on Kenny Pickett. You have to wonder about his psyche and maybe even his confidence at this moment because for 1 year, Russell Wilson, you would think, is probably going to take his job unless Kenny Pickett right now is in the weight room or is in a backfield somewhere in Pittsburgh throwing footballs to maybe wide receivers on his team or from high school or whatever. Because how I look at it is that Russell Wilson, 35 years of age, we know the resume. But over the last 3 years, despite last year, I get he had a good year, I'll give him that. But his skills have declined. He is not the same guy that's going to scramble out of the backfield or escape the pocket and try to extend plays and maybe throw it out of bounds or make a play here, make a play there. He's not that same guy. We've seen him lose a step here over the last 2 years, and it's not as if the Steeler offensive line is the Cowboy offensive line of recent vintage or the old Cowboy offensive line dating back to the Emmitt Smith, Troy Aikman, and Michael Irvin days. It's not as if he has a huge wall there in front of him that's going to protect him there at all times. And Russell Wilson, we understand. Veteran, savvy, knows how to play. But how many batted balls have we seen there in Pittsburgh over the last year, whether your name was Mitchell Trubisky, whether your name was Kenny Pickett, even Mason Rudolph, and now you have a guy who's 5'10". So for me, not only does it generate a controversy right out of the gate, because you would think when it's all said and done, Russell Wilson's going to be the starting quarterback. I mean, why not? You're getting him on the cheap, all that experience, and who knows what Mike Tomlin and the new offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith, is going to try to pluck from him over the course of this year, considering they got him for next to nothing. And then for Pickett, who, although the GM Omar Khan said that they had full faith in him going into this offseason when he said at the Combine, I talked about this last week, and now all of a sudden, it's pretty much going to be Russell Wilson's job to lose. And I get it, a healthy competition is fine, but not against a guy who's been to 2 Super Bowls, won a Super Bowl, has the resume that he has, but is also on the decline. So, how I feel about it doesn't sit well with me, because I don't think it's going to be Russell Wilson circa 2015, 2016. This is 2024. And yes, can he have his moments? Can he play well? Whatever. Of course he can. The guy knows how to play. But his offensive line, are they going to hold up throughout the course of 17 games? Is he a guy that's really going to lose a step to the point where he's going to hold the ball for too long and then get hurt? Obviously, this is all just a prediction. This is all, I can't even think of the word right now because my head is just fogged with just a bunch of different words that can't process to be able to spit out into this microphone or in front of this camera. But I'm not a big fan of it. Let's just put it that way. And yes, even though I'm prognosticating, and this is all hypothetical, those are the words I was looking for, I still don't like this move. I don't. I'd rather have, I shouldn't say rather, that's too strong. But if you were bringing in a guy like Joe Flacco, who you know is going to be the backup as insurance, because Mason Rudolph may go on to greener pastures, that I can understand. And not that I wanted Flacco to begin with. I'm just using him as the example. But Russell Wilson, doesn't sit well with me. Then you have all these other moves here, whether it's Chris Jones getting the big payday, 5 years, $95 million guaranteed on top of what they gave Drew Tranquill, 3 for 19. I understand not a lot of money, but they keep their defense intact with those two guys. And Jones, who could have moved on, and they put their money where their mouths were if you're a Lamar Hunt and company, Clark Hunt, the son of Lamar Hunt, who is dearly departed. But the Chiefs are looking to run it back again, and they bring their defensive stalwart back in the mix. That's a big move by them. Same for the Baltimore Ravens with Justin Madubuike, $98 million he got. Brandon Graham comes back to the Philadelphia Eagles for a 15th season at linebacker, but we'll have to say goodbye to Fletcher Cox as he goes off into retirement to go along with Jason Kelsey. Both they're the offensive and defensive anchors of their team. The Niners released Eric Armstead. Where does he end up? That's going to be interesting to see. Then you also have Jalen Johnson. He signed or re-signed with the Bears. 4 years, $76 million, $54 million guaranteed. Kendrick Bourne re-ups with the New England Patriots, where Mac Jones gets shipped to Jacksonville. So that experiment was done, and especially now with the new coach. In a one, Gerard Mayo. Baker Mayfield gets paid 3 years, $50 million guaranteed, $100 million. So kudos to him as he parlayed his performance there the second half in Tampa, won a playoff game, had a competitive, but fell short against the Detroit Lions there in the divisional round. And now you have to wonder what's going to happen here with these running backs as we head into Wednesday. The Saquon Barkleys, the Derrick Henrys, the Josh Jacobs of the world who were non-franchised. I'm sure they're going to go elsewhere. You would think all of them, for that matter. And I'm missing a couple. Tony Pollard is one that comes to mind. To see where they go, and even a few others. And it's weird because everybody looks forward to free agency and that curtain raising to the free agent window, and it feels as if a lot of that air has been sucked out of the room. Now, granted, you still have the running backs and obviously a ton of other players that still need to be signed, but when you see what's happened here to date, whether your name is Russell Wilson on a lesser degree, you understand this isn't Russell Wilson from 5-6 years ago, or even a guy like trades like Jerry Jeudy that was unforeseen, nobody even predicted that, and other players that got released or just re-signed with their teams, whether you're Chris Jones, Jalen Johnson, Justin Madubuike, etc. Does take a little bit of the sting out of what's going to take place here Wednesday, but I'm sure everybody's going to be just ramped up and pumped up to see what's going to happen here. So that's what you got there with the Shield and the NFL. And a couple other things before I wrap up. As far as the baseball goes, the Red Sox signed a pitcher. No, not Blake Snell. No, not Jordan Montgomery. Brian Bello. Brian who? Yes, that Brian Bello, the pitcher who actually pitched pretty well there last year. Starting pitcher for the Red Sox, 6 years, $55 million. And we talked about this on the podcast Thursday. I get it, they had to sign one of their players. They figured, hey, let's try to lock this guy in before he gets to his arbitration years. And a guy who has a live arm, had his moments there as I believe, third or fourth starter there for the Red Sox. Let's see if he moves up, and you would think he's going to have to, not only just based on the contract, because, please, when you look at a young pitcher making that type of money, although it's a handsomely paid contract, but it's certainly not in the nine figures or not going to be ranked as one of the top sells or buys in this case when it comes to free agency or even a player that's on their team to get those big dollars. I'm sure to Bello it's big dollars, money he's never seen, but certainly not amongst the likes of a lot of the other pitchers that have gotten big-time paydays, a la Zach Wheeler or even Aaron Nola. And I get it, he doesn't have the resume of those aforementioned pitchers, but still. But 6 for 55, I know that doesn't quench the Red Sox fans' thirst. They probably are looking for more of a Jordan Montgomery, even Blake Snell for that matter, that you could probably get on a short-term deal. Maybe 2 years, 1 year with an opt-out, who knows? But their priority right now, it's not about signing those big-time players. As I discussed there on Thursday's podcast, you have to go back and listen to what I said about the John Henrys and Tom Werners of the world. So that's what you have with the latest addition there, or not even addition, the latest signing in baseball. But then you also have Joey Votto going back home to his native Toronto, signing a minor league deal with the Blue Jays. So what does that mean? Is he going to make the team? I think that would be a huge boost for a Blue Jay franchise. Granted that he's 40 years old. Granted that his best days are behind him. Yes, former MVP, does get on base, has that leadership quality, being in Cincinnati for 15 years plus. And now he goes back home, maybe to be a part of a team that he could guide and even lead. Understood that he's made a couple of postseasons throughout the course of his career, never a World Series, but with the likes of the Vladimir Guerrero Jr.'s, the Bo Bichette's of the world, the Kayvon Biggio's, and I get it, you have a guy like George Springer who's won a World Series and knows his way around winning more so than Votto does, but to bring another voice, another face, another longtime veteran of the sport, I think it's a big plus. I won't say big, it's too strong. It's a good plus and a good addition. Now, he has to make the team first, and he only has a few weeks to do so. So let's see how his journey goes here in Toronto or in Dunedin, where the team is training right now, if he does make the big ball club. And then his former teammate, Noelvi Marte, who was part of that Luis Castillo trade, the pitcher who was sent to Seattle back a couple of years ago. Well, he got busted. He's going to be banned 80 games due to a performance-enhancing drug. I don't know what the drug is. I guess I got to look that up, but you're not going to see him for 80 games. He was a promising infielder who had some decent numbers last year, batted .316 in a handful of games, or more than a handful. A guy that was going to be penciled in as your shortstop, but now you're not going to see him for the first half of the season, so that's a mark on him. Strike one, if you will, and then obviously, hopefully he doesn't go down that road, because the second strike will be 160 games or 162, and then expulsion from there. So that's a tough blow for a Red team that could be a surprise this year in the National League, and to not have him in the mix, certainly a bad sign, or at least an early bad sign for the Cincinnati Reds. And that's what I got there with the baseball. And then lastly, I'm only bringing this up because this happened Friday, of all days, a weird day for a heavyweight bout. But for Francis Ngannou, the longtime UFC MMA fighter, going into his second pro boxing fight, lost in the second round to heavyweight Anthony Joshua. In the second round, he got knocked down in the first, and then he got completely KO'd in the second round. And the only reason why Ngannou was there, because this was supposed to be a matchup between Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder, but because Deontay Wilder lost a fight in December to Joseph Parker. Who? Yes, Joseph Parker. So therefore, they had to find another opponent for Joshua, and they bring in Ngannou, who world-renowned in his sport for MMA, but certainly not in boxing. This was his second fight. Did not go as planned, and who knows what his training was like heading into that fight. I'm sure it wasn't a middle-of-the-night decision to bring in Ngannou. I'm sure they gave him some time to get himself prepared and trained and ready for this fight. Well, obviously, he was not ready for Anthony Joshua. The fight was Friday in Saudi Arabia, sometime in the afternoon here on the Eastern Seaboard. Of course, Friday night there in Saudi Arabia was not on my radar. Certainly didn't know that this fight was taking place, and because it was on a Friday, it just goes to show how boxing has just really fallen off the map. Now, I understand maybe not a Saturday night. They couldn't get this fight to have it land on the schedule on the usual midnight in Saudi Arabia, which would have been what? I guess 5 in the afternoon or 4 in the afternoon here on the East Coast. But it just goes to show you how boxing is just not even a shell, as I like to say, but a carcass on the side of the road. This rich tradition sport, which I get it. It's more of a 19th into 20th century sport and has its tradition and history in this country. I'm not going to say unlike any other, but it's up there. When you think of baseball and you even think of horse racing for that matter, I got to throw them in the mix. Boxing is right up there, even with college football. But now over the last, especially into this century, it has been just a flat out dud. And the other day, Saudi Arabia is just a testament to why boxing is merely a blip on the sports radar. And here it is, wrapping up the podcast, talking about it. So who knows? Who knows what we're going to see from boxing from here on out, because it is just an atrocity. Got to call it as I see it. That'll do it, my good people. Another episode in the books. I truly appreciate you stopping by. Goes without saying how much I thank you from the bottom of my heart for you to carve out precious minutes out of your day to listen to what it is that I have to say about what goes on in the world of sports. If you haven't done so, please subscribe, rate, and review. Throw me a few stars, write a review. You know the deal, people. Always, I'm here for you. Hit me up with a question, comment, suggestion. You can do so at the following on my YouTube channel, @JReels, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, The J Reels Podcast, Twitter, X, JReels1, just a number. The old-fashioned way, The J Reels Podcast @gmail.com. I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals. Also, my new partnership, which you heard at the very top. Yes, that is not misspeaking by any stretch. Drinkolipop.com. Tons of flavors, healthy for you, good for your gut. No artificial ingredients, non-GMO, vegan, paleo, you name it. And I've tried it. I have a fridge full of it. 15% off. Use the code SODALOVE at checkout, and I'll get a bit of a kickback, people. So please, that's my first ever partnership with the brand, and I hope it's a long-lasting one at that. So your participation, not only to listening to this podcast or even viewing it here on YouTube, enormous, but even much more so to start generating not only just a relationship and a partnership with Olipop Soda, but also some revenue in the process. So one more time from my heart to you guys and gals out there who follow, listen to the podcast, whether you're my day one or this is your first day, I appreciate all of your support. Because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. It's in the blood, it's in the DNA, as I like to say, talking sports since birth. This is my full-time job, content creator, and I'm not going anywhere as long as I'm alive and breathing here, as I will continue to deliver the fire, passion, energy, and fury with my thoughts, opinions, feelings, critiques, praise, analysis on anything and everything that happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the J Reels Podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx, the South Beach, the South Central, the South Pacific, and all points beyond, peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the J Reels Podcast, all on the flip, baby.